Hi, welcome to the Trauma and Resilience Podcast. I'm Ricky Robertson. Our guest today is Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. Nadine is a doctor, author, researcher, and served as the first Surgeon General of California. Today we'll be talking about adverse childhood experiences, toxic stress, and resilience. Nadine, welcome to the program.
Ricky, thank you so much for having me.
Great to see you. So I want to start off by learning a little bit about how did you first become aware of the prevalence and the impact of adverse childhood experiences?
It was in my work as a pediatrician. I had started a clinic in one of San Francisco's most underserved neighborhoods, and I was caring for patient after patient after patient, and many of my kids were being sent to me, oftentimes by principals or teachers or folks who were running after school programs who were concerned that the child might have ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and wanting to get help for this young person, thinking most often that help was medication, right? And as I was seeing so many patients, what I kept on hearing over and over again in the histories of my patients was just the extraordinary challenges that they were experiencing in their day-to-day lives. So kids who were struggling with a parent who was substance dependent or who was experiencing physical or emotional abuse at home. And just in doing that research and starting to put two and two together around how is it that what my patients are experiencing, how is that affecting their health and the development of their brains and bodies? That's when I came across the adverse childhood experiences study. So, and that was a little bit of a mind-blowing experience for me because I did my residency training at Stanford. Like I did a lot of education. And yet, as a pediatrician, I hadn't heard about the ACE study. When I first read about it and learned that, this was this big research study that had been done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and they asked 17,500 people about experiences of adversity in childhood. Things like experiencing abuse or neglect or growing up in a household where a parent experienced chronic mental health problems or substance dependence. And that when they track that to individuals' health as adults, what they found was that the more ACEs an individual had, the greater their risk, not just for some of the things that we would imagine, like, depression, anxiety, suicidality, but also for some of the leading killers in the United States and around the world, things like heart disease, cancer, stroke. And that was a shock to me. It was a real wake-up call for me that preventing ACEs and understanding how to care for my patients who were experiencing ACEs was actually critical to my role as a physician.
I personally would feel maybe intimidated by taking on a challenge so great as addressing childhood trauma and yet also so necessary. And so what was that like for you to think about really shifting that whole paradigm around care?
Yeah. So I want to start by just backing up one quick step. And you talked about trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and toxic stress. And I just want to clarify that trauma sometimes is used as this general term, which means different things to different people. But adverse childhood experiences specifically refer to the 10 things that were looked at in the adverse childhood experiences study. And those include physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent was mentally ill, experienced substance dependence, was incarcerated, where there was parental separation or divorce, or intimate partner violence. So those are the 10 criteria that were included in the ACE study and that are considered the traditional ACEs. And then toxic stress is, we now understand, like when many of us think about toxic stress, we think about the stressor, we think about like the thing that happened. And actually what it refers to is the biological response. So it's actually the activation of the body's stress response. So increases in stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol and all the changes that happen in the body as a result. That's what we're referring to when we talk about the toxic stress response. So I just wanted to make sure that we kind of started with that so that folks really understand what that means. Yeah, and then to answer your question about how complicated the problem is and how big of a challenge it is, I think there were certainly points where it felt daunting, but so there's this weird thing about me, which is that I like to take something that feels like a weakness and turns it into a strength. Right. So when something feels really complicated and daunting, that's an opportunity. It means that there are lots of different ways to approach it. It means that there are lots of stakeholders in solving this problem. Right. And so when we think about the fact that when a child has experienced ACEs, that it affects their health, it affects their growth, it affects their development, it affects their ability to sit in a class and learn. That means that doctors get to be problem solvers, educators get to be problem solvers, anyone, like the bus driver gets to be a problem solver, like everyone who is impacted or has a role to play gets to be part of the solution. And so that's really how I looked at it.
And then how did that shape your work as California's first Surgeon General?
I will say, coming into my role as California's first Surgeon General, ACEs and toxic stress were at the top of my agenda because the governor appointed me really to go upstream and look at the factors that ultimately impact so many aspects of our lives and the functioning of our society. And when we look at the impact of ACEs on everything from healthcare to public safety to the competitiveness of our workforce, right? It was a no-brainer. And there was so much opportunity there. And the interesting thing about being the Surgeon General is that it really gave the opportunity to take a public health approach. When we talk about ACEs, right now, there is so much of the way that our society responds to ACEs as an issue that is very focused on the individual. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you can get 10 weeks of this certain program. And it's very individually focused. When everything we've ever learned about public health is that if you have, a population of people and 70% of them are affected with the same problem, you can work on your individual treatment for that problem, or you can focus on how do we change the environment in our society so that instead of 70% of people having this problem, maybe 30% or 20% or none, right? And so that is like the difference between seeing all these people get some kind of, infectious disease like cholera and giving each individual person treatment versus sanitizing the water, right? We as a society really need to look at, okay, so what are we doing in in healthcare? What are we doing in early childhood? What are we doing in our justice system? What are we doing in our educational system across the board to make all of our systems more trauma sensitive, more trauma informed, so that our systems become part of the solution instead of part of the problem?
I think that's so important for educators to hear, because I meet with a lot of different educators across the country who sometimes feel like aspects of this work fall on their shoulders alone, and really understanding that it is about building, like you said, this environment or this kind of community of care around young people, around children, around entire communities to support their well-being, and understanding that schools and educators can play an important role in that and be part of something that also involves connecting with healthcare providers or mental health clinicians. And so I think that kind of community of care model is just so important. And I'm curious about, for folks who may not be familiar, as California Surgeon General, your office authored the Roadmap for Resilience, which was kind of this groundbreaking policy guiding document. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what the Roadmap for Resilience is, and what a resource it is, and really kind of a game-changing kind of paradigm shift that looks at how to build those environments or those communities of care.
The Roadmap for Resilience was a labor of love for
Yeah.
me. And it really starts with grounding in the science, because I think our solutions are really going to be, for me, as strong as, really understanding the problem and using shared language and using, like, having everyone really work from that same foundation. So we really grounded in the science and looked at the strongest evidence. And then we took that and laid out a cross-sector approach. And so what that meant was, we did a cross-sector approach in terms of what are the roles and what are some practical, we can do it right now, everyday things that we can be doing in different sectors of our society. And we really focused it on three ways. One is prevention, one is early detection and early intervention, and then the third way is more intensive, treatment and response. And really laying out that all three are necessary. I think there's been some debate in the field as, oh, we should be focusing on prevention, or how come you're only talking about treatment? And it's a little bit like, which is more important, the heart or the lungs? Well, you need all of it, right? You need all of these pieces need to work together. And the great part of it is that we each get to play our position. So if you're an educator, you have a very, very important role to play in delivering the daily doses of healing interactions that can make the difference for a kid, right? But in order to be able to do that, we have to recognize that you have to be supported to be well, right? So all, like, what type of infrastructure is necessary? We can't just tell our educators, hey, you're really important on the front lines with our kids. And I think the parallel for me is, with COVID, we had healthcare providers, we had educators, we had all these folks who were on the front lines, and we gave them PPE, right? We gave them personal protective equipment. It's the same thing needs to happen when we're addressing ACEs and toxic stress. We need to make sure that our systems, our infrastructure, are there to protect our people on the front lines. And that can be trainings and information and structure and support, but also, opportunities for our frontline folks to deal with their own issues and concerns and have a safe place to be able to do that.
I've heard you speak before on and mentioned that our ACEs can sometimes become our superpowers. And that I was thinking as you talked about, educators providing those healing doses of interaction and the way that that can support a young person's well-being and their resilience, and how that connects to kind of nurturing some of those healing powers. And would you share a little bit more about what you mean by that, about how our own ACEs can become our superpowers? I think that's relevant for kids as well as for educators who may be going in their own journey of healing.
So when we talk about our ACEs being our superpowers, one of the things that the research tells us is that one of the most important interventions to prevent some of the long-term harms from ACEs is the development of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments. And especially, I see among educators that ability to look at a young person and say, I see you. I can understand what's going on for you. And I can see that behavior and I can create a safe space for you to be able to work some of this out. The place where I see that happening over and over and over again are from the folks who know what it's like to walk a little bit in those shoes, right? Who recognize, wow, when I had my own difficult experiences in childhood, I wish that someone had been there for me. And so I'm actually going to take extra time in my day to be there for this young person. It's such a motivator. And I say that both in terms of my experience with interacting with, educators around the country, but also it's very personal for me. When I first started learning about ACEs, and there was very little in terms of coordinated response. And that just wasn't okay with me. And the reason that it wasn't okay with me is because I knew what it feels like to be in that place. And on my watch, I was not going to leave the young people who were in my charge, who I was in charge of their health care. I wasn't going to leave them in that place. And so, yeah, that meant I had to stay up late and I'd sometimes be in the clinic until midnight. And maybe that meant that I would be, pulling research articles. And when people told me, oh, no, there's no program to deal with this or this, and I would say, you know what? If that doesn't exist, we're going to create it, because I am not going to leave these people, these young people, these kids. I'm not going to leave them here. So that for me, I've seen that among so many people who are leaders in this space. They have done so much to create a different reality for the next generation and a greater understanding and openness and response to ACEs and toxic stress. And for many of us, we're motivated by our own experiences.
Thank you. Thank you. I can certainly relate to that. Absolutely. I think in my own journey in this work, there was so much where, as I was learning, I mean, I was a teacher at the time, but I realized so much of my own healing was part of this. I had tried to, I think, cope with my own history of ACEs, and by going right from hurting to trying to help, and I kind of skipped over the healing process for myself. Right? There's a saying in 12-step recovery that we go from hurting to healing to helping, and I tried to jump right from hurting into helping. And sometimes as a teacher, that meant that I became totally, enmeshed with my work, and I needed better boundaries. And I was also sometimes, I think, trying to rescue kids rather than empower them. I mean, there was so much in my own journey that so much of my own healing journey that still had to take place. And so learning about ACEs and trauma and toxic stress helped to begin that journey. And I definitely relate to what you shared about looking at our own histories and our own experiences, and then just want to honor the way that you have shown up for, I mean, your legacy will leave a legacy of whole people. I mean, just the hundreds of thousands, and potentially, I mean, the ripple effect really is global with your work in terms of the ways that you've transformed policy and the way the public health views trauma and ACEs and toxic stress and ways to better support kids. So that is an incredible contribution. That is a superpower.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Nadine, I'm just curious, are there any books or anything that you've read lately that you would recommend that folks check out if they wanted to learn more about adverse childhood experiences or some of the topics that we're discussing?
Yes. In fact, I will say one of my favorite books on the topic, I just finished reading it, is What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry. And it is excellent.
That is a hero's journey. Yeah. Absolutely. And I guess a couple questions as we start to wrap up our conversation. One is just kind of simple, if this opportunity to talk with educators that will be listening or viewing this conversation, are there any suggestions that you have specifically for ways that they can care for themselves and ways that they can care for their students? And you've talked about that certainly, but I just want to offer some space if there's any particular suggestions you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we talk about in the roadmap for resilience are just 7 simple strategies that are backed up by evidence that really help us to be able to regulate ourselves. And that include things like sleep, exercise, nutrition, mindfulness, mental health care, um, time in nature, and safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And we talk about that in terms of for the young people that we're caring for or serving, but it's equally as important for us. And so that's the thing that I would say to educators is that we need you and we need you to be well. So please take that time to put your oxygen mask on. Self-care is not selfish. Like I say this all the time. Um, and this is long work,
Mm.
right? And so uh, being able to care for ourselves is also key for us to be able to be here long enough to be able to realize the change that we're seeking to make.
Thank you. And so my final question at this point in this long work, in this long journey, how has this work changed you?
Mm, I would say this work has changed me profoundly.
Mm.
Um, I think that very similar to you, um, coming from my own experiences of ACEs, I went into the world and was very focused on kind of surviving and proving myself um, and what this work has really taught me was about my own vulnerability and
Mm.
why it's so important for me to care for myself well because not only as someone who wants to be in this field for a long time, long enough to make a difference, but also as a mom of 4 boys, there are times when I just need to take a moment and say, taking that time out to nurture myself, giving myself that opportunity to be vulnerable. I had always thought I'm strong. I'm, all of the above. And just that opportunity to say, you know what, it's okay for me to be vulnerable. It's okay for me to ask for the help that I need. It's okay for me to get the support that I need and deserve, and that maybe I didn't get at some points in my life, but that I can get it now, and I can make it for myself now. And that's um, it's a hard thing to sit with, but it's been one of the most important things for me to be able to do this work, to do it over a long period of time, and to be well doing it.
Thank you, Dr. Burke Harris. This conversation has meant a lot to me, and I know and believe that it will certainly benefit those who listen. The Trauma and Resilience series is made possible by a partnership between the National Education Association and WETA. For more information, please visit adlit.org/trauma. Trauma and Resilience is available on YouTube and on every major podcast platform. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to the whole series so you won't miss an episode.